Thank you so much for coming out here to speak. I think I saw you the last time at the Free Speech Advocacy. You have a very funny and comedic way of talking about a lot of these sensitive topics, I would say, right?
I try, yeah.
And so I wanted to talk about, I guess, the sensitive topics when we talk about Islam. What do you think it's sometimes difficult here, in Western cultures, to criticize or talk about some of the problems in Islam? Than it is in the same vein, it's easy for people to criticize Christianity, right? And no one's going to get upset over that. What do you think that is, you think?
I think it's generally viewed because within some segments of American society, they view that Islam as a minority religion, even though it's the second biggest religion in the world. So globally, it's the second biggest religion. But in America, at least within Western societies, it's viewed as a minority religion. And so there's a term my friend coined, Al-Rizvi, which he called Islamophobia phobia,
Yes.
which is the fear of being perceived as kind of white, judgmental person of different cultures, or in that case, different religions. And they also associate religion, Islam in particular, with brown people or brown ethnic groups, which is false. I mean, statistically, there are also Muslims who are whites. There are white converts to Islam. I mean, I just met one at the conference who's Caucasian and converted to Islam. So someone, regardless of the race, can be a Muslim. It's a universal religion. So I think so there is this element of a kind of Islamophobia phobia.
Right.
Is that the fear of being perceived as judgmental? It's their culture. There is a fear of kind of colonialism that because British Kingdom or United States have intervened in the Middle East, some Muslim countries, there is a fear that we are going to tell them what to do, and we should not tell them what to do. They have their own culture, and it's wrong by default to tell other people from different cultures what to do. So I think that while Christianity is more viewed as a domestic religion, right? So it's okay if you shame evangelicals and think they're crazy. I mean, I was having a debate, and I think in Northern California, and I said, what do you call a white Republican who is against gay marriage? He said, I call him a bigot. And I said, thank you for calling 90% of Muslims bigots. Then he said, I never said that. Then I said, okay, but if you apply different standards for people based upon their race, because you view the Muslims as the brown and the Republicans as the white, who's the one being racist? Because you're not applying universal human rights standards for everyone. So yeah, this is, I think, is kind of the reason why people kind of even though they condemn the homophobia, let's say the misogyny that comes from domestic cultures, but they try to be kind of more culturally sensitive when it comes to other cultures and religion.
Right, and you say that would be a problem with freedom of speech you'll find then in those kind of areas. Would you find then that there's a separation of church and state, or do you find I find sometimes in those cultures there's no separation of church and state, right? The problems do find people will talk about in Europe, for example, it's very difficult for them to talk or criticize what you said. And so what do you think of what's going on in Europe then with the immigration coming in into Europe, particularly Great Britain, Germany, and those kinds of places?
Well, unfortunately, there hasn't been many successful places with separation of mosque and state that exist in the Muslim world. Recently, the good news is that Tunisia, just kind of a modern democracy, early democracy, they have established a separation of mosque and state. So, and actually by democracy. So, because most of the examples of secularism in the Middle East have came through force. So Turkey, Erdogan was not an democratically elected leader. He kind of waged the war, and now it's backfire in Turkey, in which Erdogan, the Islamist country, and back to Europe. I think that so Europe is kind of a different animal than the United States, and I'm an immigrant as well. I'm an immigrant to the United States, and I have chosen the United States, even though I was offered to go to Europe. And I think with Europe is that that has been kind of viewed as a radical view, but I think it's pretty normal in my opinion, is that with Europe, the nation states and ethnicity is kind of tied into each other. So, Europe, as these are modern states that we see them, are there is kind of real German, right? There's a real German, real the Francophone, the Anglo-Saxon. All of these became nations. And what happened is so they have a kind of an identity that is mixed up with the ethnic group, and kind of a sense of nationalism that is attached to it and has produced so much damage in the case of Germany before. And then there is a culture that comes in that also viewed itself, I mean, well, a large segment of it, that viewed itself as kind of the best religion in the world. So when you have like nationalistic supremacy on one hand and religious supremacy on the other, they immediately clash.
Right.
And that's why you see like and also, I mean, I have multiple views about it also because I think the European countries have also a strong welfare system to the way that have attracted people different than the way America did. So the American welfare system, sometimes criticized, but it's not as big as Europe.
Right.
So what happened is that many people who came to Europe were like kind of coming for the free stuff. So Sweden, you get like 3,000 euros or something like that in welfare. So the way that it attracted a certain type of immigrants who also believe in a kind of a supremacist culture, and immediately that causes a clash. And I think I'm not really optimistic about the future of Europe unless. So I was giving a speech in Denmark about almost a month ago. Is that unless, for example, that the Europeans also like widen their identity, in which I think becomes inclusive of people who are non-white or and also at the same time apply a different standard that they should not go to this like weird phase of multiculturalism in which FGM happening in Muslim neighborhoods, that's fine. No,
right.
I think that one of the advices I gave when I was in Denmark is that all the schools, because in Denmark they also private schools get government funding, which is kind of weird. So they're not actually really private.
Right. Yeah.
Is that there should be no government funding for every religious school, including Islamic ones, that do not teach integration. Like all these schools that teach gays should be killed, infidels,
right.
There should be no government funding whatsoever to them. And the West, I mean, the Enlightenment, those who base their countries on the values of the Enlightenment should be standing for them and not try to apply different standards on people. So I think there is a solution on both ends, and we have to support the voices of moderates within the Muslim world and not try to kind of sleep while there is a problem there, try to not acknowledge it and just be culturally sensitive. I think, and the thing is, like many people from the Middle East, where I grew up, acknowledge that there is a problem. It's mostly this like Islamophobia are the one who are trying to damage the conversation, who don't want to see any reform in the Muslim world. And I think we have to be honest about there is a problem within the Muslim communities that needs to be addressed, and we have to support the moderates against the extremists.
Right. I would say, like you mentioned, there is a stark difference, I would say, Muslim communities here in the United States and then Europe, and here they tend to more adopt the Western cultures, right? So the acclimatization of like Western values, right? So they don't find so much problems here as you find, I would say, like in Europe, where they're not adopting the kind of values and they're kind of creating, you could say, like what people would say, like Sharia towns, right? Or law towns, right? And so I think there was like a problem, I guess, in terms like even like the Prime Minister of Turkey at one point said, when he was trying to campaign in European states and they refused for him to campaign there because Turkish citizens hold dual citizenship, he said, well, I'm just going to release the gates and just, flood your countries with migrants and Muslims, and we'll see, what Europe looks like in a couple of generations from now.
I mean, he's trying to weaponize refugees,
right?
And use them as a kind of a foreign policy tool, which is very bad in principle.
Right. I think so too. I think what do you think of like there's a lot of talk about here, for example, in feminism, talking about like, we still need more rights, we're not equal to men, but when you look at other places like in the Middle East, it's like, well, maybe that's where the places where you should kind of focus. What do you think of like the Middle East capability then, its compatibility or attempts to modernize it or westernize these kind of values? So your prognosis of that being possible?
Well, I mean, at the moment, there are some cultures that are, some societies in the Middle East that are, Northern Africa are better than others. So as I said, in Tunisia, for example, they recently passed a law that says women inheritance is equal to men, which is viewed as a controversial in many Muslim societies. But there is a movement out there that's trying to push it. Also in Lebanon, in Iraq, there are some movements. As it comes to the West, I think that somebody can address what I have an issue with is when someone says that there is no problem of they say, like, for example, celebration of modesty culture. The hijab, for example, the Women's March. was celebrated. There was a woman hijab speaker. And the thing is, like, I mean, this is a symbol of modernist culture. I mean, imagine if an Amish person is celebrated as a form of liberation, people would laugh their ass off. But as long as it's coming from Muslim societies, it's now a symbol of feminism and a symbol of. But that being said, I mean, feminists in the West kind of still do their own fight in the West, and at the same time, because I mean, like, just because like the Middle East has a cancer doesn't mean you don't have to cure diabetes, right? So even though there are levels of discrimination against women that are different in the West than in the Middle East, doesn't mean that women in the West should not do their own fight. But as long as they acknowledge the fight of their sisters in the Muslim societies who are trying to make their societies better.
Because there was a time of, like, in Iran where people didn't have to be forced to wear like hijabs, and that kind of, like, there's pictures you can see it, like what they look like, I think, like in the 70s.
In Iraq too, and so many other countries.
What happened?
Well, I mean, unfortunately, the revolution by Ayatollah Khomeini happened in 1979, 78, and then the establishment of a theocracy in Iran. Actually, I mean, one of the pictures that I find really interesting is that Iranian women, so when the Islamic Revolution won, there was the last revolution of women in Iran trying to say, don't impose the hijab on us. So, I mean, since that era, I mean, and then in Iraq, we got Saddam Hussein. And then Saudi Arabia had their own issues in which the Wahhabis took over Mecca, and then the kingdom, the kings had to reconcile a deal with the extremists so he can maintain his rule and at the same time maintain the extremists. So since that then, I mean, the Arab world has went downhill.
Opposite direction.
Completely opposite direction. But now there is kind of, I mean, I was mentioning in my speech is that the internet is now being what the printing press was to the West. So the printing press is mostly, I mean, not the only reason, but it was the main reason how the Enlightenment values and classical liberalism spreaded. The internet now is what is kind of changing the Muslim world. And I mentioned many projects now happening in the Arab world that try to make that happen.
I guess I think in Saudi Arabia, they're now allowing women to drive.
Well, yeah.
As long as the car wears a hijab or something like that.
No. Well, I mean, it's really interesting how, like, I mean, many people were celebrating, but obviously it's a cause for celebration, but at the same time, it's just really sad that in the 21st century, we're celebrating the one woman's right to wear a car. I mean, and people were like so happy. I'm like, okay, this should be like taken for granted that women should be allowed to drive. I mean, but I mean, I think that it is possible that Saudi Arabia is kind of moving to the right direction, and also, I mean, I think there's a political reason for it because the royal family is losing legitimacy among the extremists. So the more they can push for reforms, the more that they can at least maintain their legitimacy as rulers. So, for example, like the Muslim Brotherhood and extremist element of Salafis consider the royal family to be like puppets of the West. So the best way for them, to these kings now, to do is kind of reform Saudi society. So in that way they can maintain their legitimacy, and then the society sees them as the good guys compared to the Muslim Brotherhood and the Salafi jihadists. So maybe Saudi Arabia is going to the right direction. I mean, I hope.
Right. An interesting part of culture, there's like something you mentioned a while ago in talking about like white people make up, you would say, like the most violent of extremists. Can you clarify that? In terms of white people have no culture. I thought that was a very interesting comment. So
this has actually happened as a result of some interviews I have done with white Muslim converts. And I've always find that subject very fascinating. It's like, why would a Western person convert to Islam? I mean, and I think is that some of it, at least some of the attraction, is that Eastern religions and Eastern cultures are viewed as exotic, while like, I mean, American culture is very new. It's a very modern state, right? So there is no strong identity as it is in Eastern cultures.
Yeah.
So some of them get attracted to that, and then when they get attracted and become Muslims, they're also viewed as like foreigners. So they have to prove themselves to be more extreme than those who are born Muslim. So there is a very significant percentage. I mean, I need to do the research more into that. There's a significant percentage of white converts who became violent extremists. And the reason is that they want to prove to their fellow Muslims that even though I'm white, but I'm really religious. I'm really religious. Right. So they tend to be more extreme than actually those who are born into the faith. So that's what I was talking about I think in the podcast about.
Yeah, that's interesting. I was like, I've never heard of that. Kind of makes sense. And then I guess you would say like the prognosis for that would be go to your local Irish festival, go to Oktoberfest, right?
Yeah. And it gets boring. I mean, how many beers are you going to try for October? Yeah.
But you can also say maybe sometimes cultural Marxism kind of plays a role in that, in saying that, celebrate Hispanic Heritage Month, Black History Month, but they kind of condemn and put down white history, for example, and they find it to be like not something you should kind of go out there and celebrate or embrace. And I think that maybe turns people to look elsewhere, like you said, maybe a minority religion, so to speak.
Yeah, I mean, there's like, for example, like in major cities, Vancouver, New York included, there is like many like Buddhist like stores of like all of these yoga, and because it's like viewed as authentic cultures, which is, I mean, it's a half of truth, obviously. I mean, white people, even though that's kind of a weird term, because like that's but like Europe had a civilization. America does not. America is a very modern one, but it's like this Buddhism, Taoism is always viewed as this exotic, like religions. They have a culture that has existed for thousands of years, and so yeah. I mean, I don't know about cultural Marxism, but I think it's like this kind of the need for a strong identity that some people look. I mean, I think someone can develop a strong identity from a modern state, but I think like some people want to just use the other cultures that seem to have a more entrenched identity there.
All right. Well, thank you so much for being a champion of free speech and championing free markets. This has been a terrific day. Good to see you again.
Good to see you too.
Please continue your work.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.